Go ahead and be turning your Bibles to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12 will be taking our lesson tonight. Acts chapter 12. And I'd like to begin by reading the first 4 verses of that chapter. Acts chapter 12, beginning of verse 1 through verse 4. Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers, or quaternions, if you will, of soldiers, to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. Just to frame Acts chapter 12 and to bring us up to speed on what's exactly going on here and what's happened up to this point. This Herod is Herod Agrippa the First, and he is the grandson of Herod the Great. And in the beginning, he ruled the area of Galilee, but later on, he came in favor with the Roman emperor, specifically Caligula. And so he was granted not only Galilee to rule, but Samaria and Judea as well. So we see a man here in Acts chapter 12, Herod Agrippa, that rules an area almost the size of his grandfather, Herod the Great, ruled. Almost that size, although he didn't have influence in Idumea and other regions. But it was a large area that he ruled. And what we know from Herod Agrippa is he was a staunch, if you will, he had staunch pro-Jewish policies. And he was really against the Christians in a really big way, in oppressing the church, if you will. And we understand when he died in 44 AD, because we know that from secular history. He ruled about 7 years, if you will, that region, under the auspices of a Roman vassal. But to bring us up to speed to Acts chapter 12, we see in Acts chapter 8, after Stephen's speech and his death, there was a great persecution that arose in the church, if you will. And then in Acts chapter 9, we see the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, and we see that incident there. And we see there also, we have an inkling of Peter's ministry, where he does raise the dead during that time, Dorcas, of course. And then in Acts chapter 10, we see that Peter's sent to the house of Cornelius in Caesarea. And we have the opening of the church unto the Gentiles. And then Acts chapter 11, we see Peter's report about that back in Jerusalem concerning Cornelius and the opening of the church to the Gentiles. We see the scattering of Christians in Acts chapter 11 to places like Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch. And when the Christians go up there and spread the gospel, Barnabas is sent up there to check on the work that's in Antioch. And it's there, as you notice here in verse 26 of chapter 11, where they're first called Christians in Antioch there. Now, if you give a time frame to this, from the time of Pentecost to the time of Acts chapter 12, it's been about 10 years, okay, between Acts 2 and Acts 12, Pentecost in AD 33, and we're going to see the death of Herod here in AD 44. So it's been 10 or 11 years up to this point that the church has been scattered in this region that we have around here. And that brings us up to Acts chapter 12. And remember, Herod Agrippa is very pro-Jewish. And there's a real persecution of the church that's going on during this time. And you see here that he actually takes an apostle, if you will, for the first time and executes him. And if you remember when the church was scattered, the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. You remember that? They stayed in Jerusalem as a base, if you will, as the gospel was being spread out to other regions. We understand Peter and John went to Samaria and so forth when Philip was having success there to lay hands on people. But by and large, the apostles stayed in Jerusalem in this early part of the church. Later on, they'll be traveling to other places after the death of James and the release of Peter. They'll be traveling to other places in the world in order to spread the gospel. And so we see here this man, Herod Agrippa I, he puts James in prison. We know this is James, the brother of John, the sons of Zebedee. And he executes James to please the Jews. And he sees that this pleases the Jews so much that he also arrests Peter now during the time of the Passover. During the time of the Passover, and he puts these troops in charge of him to guard him, particularly because he thinks there may be some trouble. Remember, there are thousands and thousands of Christians in Judea at this point. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians in Jerusalem and Judea. So he assigns this 4 squads of 4. So he assigns specifically 16 guards specifically to guard Peter, because you got thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the church in Judea and Jerusalem. You might think there might be some trouble. And so he puts these soldiers in charge of them. But you notice as the story unfolds here, we see that Peter's not going to be in prison. We always wondered why God allowed James to be executed, but he saved Peter. You ever wonder about that? Mm-hmm. The idea, why did he save? Well, we don't know the workings of God. We don't know why he does these types of things. Maybe James had done what he needed to do, and Peter was not done yet. But anyway, we see here that Peter is in the prison, and it is Herod's intention, you'll notice here, to bring him out in verse 4. That means he's going to bring him out to a public execution. It's not going to be anything private. It's not going to be in the prison. It's not going to be somewhere off by themselves. It's going to be a public execution. Remember, Herod Agrippa is a great, staunch enemy of the church. And we're going to see why God slays him because of that. And so, Peter's in prison. Let's notice here at the beginning of verse 5. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being fervently made by the church to God. On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter's side, and he woke him up, and saying, "Get up quickly," and his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed through the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from them. Now you notice here in verse 2 that James was put to death with the sword. There were 2 methods of putting people to death with the sword. We don't know which one was used here. Is either you put the sword through the heart, or you chop their head off with a sword, or some means such as that. A sword wasn't really a good weapon to chop heads off with. Usually it was a larger weapon like an axe and so forth that could be used in such swing in such a way. Probably he was pierced through the heart with the sword. And so this was Herod's method of killing James. And so Peter was probably going to be executed publicly the same way. But do you remember what Jesus told Peter in John 21? How he's going to die. Someone's going to stretch you out and take you where you don't want to go, alluding that Peter is going to be crucified for the Lord. And so we know how the Lord's working this out. Now, James was killed with the sword, but Peter, you're not going to be killed with the sword. You're going to be later on, you're going to be crucified for my name. But we see here that God performs a miracle in order to bring Peter out of this jail. He's guard. There's 16 guards specifically. There's 2 guards that are assigned him that are around him. And an angel of the Lord appears unbeknownst to the guards. They don't see this angel. He goes up and he strikes Peter's sides, and the chains fall off of him, and they take him and they lead him out of the prison, out into the open. They pass the first and the second guard. It's very interesting there. He's in the deepest part of the prison. The first gate, of course, is the outer gate. The second gate is the inner gate as you go into the prison. And down in here would be the cells where the prisoners were kept. And usually it was the worst kind of prisoners, if you will. Those who they would consider murderers or traitors or kidnappers or what have you. They had him down here in this lower part, if you will, guarding him securely. Again, probably thinking there's going to be some sort of trouble. Remember, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians in Judea and Samaria at this point. And so he goes out. They pass through these gates. They go out into the city, out into the open. And when he gets out there, and I think this is unusual too, the angel leaves him. So there he's standing. Can you imagine being led out? He still thinks it's kind of a vision at this point, as we'll see. He thinks it's kind of a dream, kind of a vision. And he's led out, and there he stands. Now, what would you do? Well, I'm not really sure what I would do. I'm not really sure what I would do. But he comes up with an idea. Notice here, beginning at verse 11. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." So an epiphany comes to him, a realization. Oh, this is because Herod's going to execute me. And the Lord has done this to save my life, if you will. But notice here the bravery of Peter, which kind of we lose in this. He doesn't flee the city, does he? He doesn't head to the countryside. He doesn't head up the road to Caesarea. He doesn't head down to Egypt. He doesn't try to flee the city. No, he seeks out the brethren. He seeks out the brethren. Notice here in verse 12. And when he had realized, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So what are they praying about? Well, they're praying about Peter, right? Because that's what it says earlier in the chapter. They were gathered together praying about him fervently, if you will. The church was praying for Peter. And so he comes to this place that he knows where the saints are gathered. And then you'll notice here in verse 13. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. John Mark's mother's house. He goes to John Mark's mother's house. And he knocks on the door. The servant girl comes. It's interesting how Luke has these little details. He says a servant girl, not a servant girl, but he says a servant girl named who? Rhoda. Everybody's important, right? In the church. Everybody's important. And so Rhoda comes to, she recognizes, notice verse 14. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. Have you ever been so excited that you didn't realize what was going on around you? So excited about something that you just want to shake everybody's hand. You just don't know what's going on around you. The realization doesn't hit you. What you should do in the moment. You just, want to celebrate the moment. Well, here's Rhoda. She hears the voice of Peter. And it says here, because of her joy, she did not open the gate. She was so excited that she couldn't wait to tell people that Peter was at the gate. Now, would we have opened the gate? I don't know. Maybe we'd been too excited to open the gate. But she was so excited to hear Peter's voice that she ran and she wanted to announce to people that Peter was standing there. But notice the reaction of those gathered to pray for Peter. They said to her, "You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. The question always arises, well, if they're praying for Peter, why are they surprised he's standing at the gate? Right? I mean, if they're praying for Peter, then why are they surprised that he's standing at the gate? Well, I'm going to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. There may be a couple of reasons for that. I don't know, but I'm going to throw these out to you, why they would act that way. First of all, they might not have been praying for Peter to be released. They may have been praying for Peter to have strength to endure what he's going through. Because sometimes when you see a situation where there is a hostage or there's somebody in prison that's been sentenced to be put in prison, you pray for their strength to endure the situation that they're in. That's quite possibly what they're praying for. I don't know. A second alternative could be that they may be suddenly surprised at the suddenness of the answer to the prayer. I mean, that's pretty quick, isn't it? Peter's put in jail. They're praying. It's only been a few hours, if you will. And here's Peter standing at the door. I don't know if that's true, but it's just something to chew on, if you will. Do you think that by praying for Peter, they had faith in God? I'm sure they did. Maybe they were praying this: God, you just work it out the way you need to work it out. And help Peter in whatever capacity you think you need to help him. So, maybe, I don't know. Just something to think about. But they said, you're out of your mind. They go and they are amazed that he has been released. And I'm sure there's a lot of joy going on there. But notice here the repercussions of what happens. Notice verses 17 through 19. The repercussions of what happens. But motioning them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord has led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James, that's the Lord's brother, that's the other James, and the brethren. Then he left and went to another place. So we always look at that, then he left and went to another place. You kind of wonder why he went to another place. Well, it seems simple to me. He doesn't want to put these people in danger. Would you think? I mean, he's still a fugitive on the run. And if John Mark's mother brings him into her home, then the authorities, if they find him there, will say that they harbored a fugitive and they may put them into prison. And so that may be the reason that Peter stays there for just a little while, tells them what's going on. You go tell James and the brethren, you tell the leaders of the church what's happened, and I'm going to go to another place. I'm going to go someplace else, wherever that was. But notice here in verses 18 and 19 what happens. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. Notice the small thing here. They didn't notice Peter was gone till it was daytime. Did you see that? It's night. He's released. I don't know how many hours it was. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. But you'll notice here the way it's worded, when day came the disturbance. You don't think for 1 minute that those two soldiers were on either side of him, that once he left and then Peter got outside and went to Rhoda's house, they looked at one another and noticed Peter was gone and just sat there the whole night or an hour or two in the dark? No. There's a lot of miracles going on here, isn't there? God can work it, can't he? Amen? God can work it. And so when day came, there was a disturbance. And they wondered what could have become of Peter. And what happens next to these soldiers? Notice here verse 19. When Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered them to be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. That examining the guards isn't just questioning the guards, guys. What that's doing there, you're stripping the guards of their armor, you're tying them to poles, and you're getting whips, and you're questioning them to get the truth out of them. That's what examining the guards means. What these guards went through. And they could only tell the truth. Well, he was there, and then he wasn't. We thought he was there, and now he's gone. What else could they say? Because if they said, we released him, they'd be in just as much trouble as anything else. Because if you lose a prisoner, you lose your life. You remember the Philippian jailer? When Paul and Silas were in the jail singing at midnight, and then suddenly there was an earthquake, and all the shackles came off, and the doors opened, and the jailer got his sword. What was he going to do? He's going to kill himself. Why? Because he was responsible for the prisoners. If any escaped, it would have been his life. And so when Paul called out and said, Don't harm yourself, we're all here. That was a great relief to the Philippian jailer. He knew it was a miracle, and he said, men and brethren, well, I mean, not men and brethren, what shall I do? He said, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to be saved? And so these men were dead men walking either way. But see, then we see a scene with Herod, because God has got to get this guy out of the way. He goes to, actually, we're in verse 20, that history tells us that he goes to Caesarea. And the people of Tyre and Sidon come down to see him. Now, there were some games going on in Caesarea. There were some Olympic-type games there in Caesarea. They had a large arena, if you will, of whatever they call it. And they were holding these games, and Herod Agrippa was the master of ceremony. He was the honored guest during this time. And notice here what happens in the beginning of verse 20. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. With one accord they came to him, having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain. They were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. Tyre and Sidon were on the coast. There were cities on the coast. They didn't have large agricultural areas around Tyre and Sidon. Yes, there were some, but the land was not as good as in Galilee. Remember, Herod Agrippa ruled Galilee as well. So Galilee had really good land to grow crops. And so they would get a lot of their food from Galilee to Tyre and Sidon. Now, they had fishing industries in Tyre and Sidon, the dye industry in Tyre, and so forth going on. And so there became a trade dispute between Herod's country, which is Galilee, and Tyre and Sidon, and they wanted to win. They won over his most trusted counselor to try to get this trade agreement, if you will, settled. But they kind of take it too far to try to butter him up. You notice here in verse 21. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not a man." So what happens is, and what Josephus records is, Herod comes out and he's got this luxurious silver gown on that shines in the sun as he walks out. And people are looking up and, oh, he's not a man, he's a God. Look at him shine, if you will. But he doesn't correct the crowd. He doesn't say, no, I'm not a God, stop doing that, or any such thing. But notice what happens to him. Verse 23. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. Josephus records for us that while he was on the rostrum over the crowd and he was soaking in all the glory, that suddenly he got this great pain in his abdomen down here, in his belly, and he doubled over in front of the crowd. History records that. And then later on, Josephus says, these worms ate him up. These worms ate him up. God took him out of the way. And notice what happens in verse 24 because of this. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. And to be multiplied. So we see this man, a great oppressor of the church, pro-Jewish, killed James, wanted to kill Peter, and I guarantee you this, if he got away with Peter, he would have gone after the rest of them. John, Matthew, the whole lot, if he got him in successful. Because remember, they stayed around Jerusalem in the early years. And so he's going to meticulously take out the leadership and take care of this cult, if you will, this sect, this way, if you will, that is in opposition to the Jews. But the Lord of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. So as we look at this story here in Acts chapter 12, what spiritual lessons can we draw from this? What spiritual lessons? Well, there's several, but a couple, three here to think about. Number one, that prayer can be answered suddenly and surprisingly, can it not? God can answer prayer, snap a finger, right? Or he can answer prayer in his providence and will down the road. Or his answer can be no. Right? And so we see here almost, well, in the same day at least, that the prayers of the saints were answered. No, someone might say, well, it's God's will that Peter should have been saved. But that doesn't matter, does it? Because aren't we to pray for God's will anyway? When we pray to God for things to happen in our lives, we say, well, God, Lord, we'd like this to happen, or we want this person healed, or we want that to happen. Don't we pray in His will be done? I'm sure that the prayers of the saints on that night were a fragrant aroma unto God. Because those people cared about Peter, did they not? And they cared about what was going to happen to him. And people wonder, well, why didn't they pray about James? Well, we don't know. They may have prayed about James. It may have been so sudden that they didn't even have time to gather to pray about him. We don't know the situation. I'm sure they cared about James as much as they did Peter. But prayers can be answered suddenly and surprisingly, if you will. God answers prayers in His time. I think a second spiritual lesson that we can take from this is that God removes obstacles when His will needs to be done. You know, we understand that God uses evil people to fulfill His purpose. If they're not on His side, He's going to use them anyway. That He's going to fulfill His will, that He's going to bring about things in this life, whether it be nations or individuals or whoever it may be. He's going to bring about His will. He used Nebuchadnezzar, did He not? An evil man. He uses tyrants of the past in order to bring about His will, and then He takes them out of the way. We see here that Herod was getting in the way of his will. He was oppressing the people of God, and he had killed one of the apostles, and no doubt he went after the others. God decided, I've got to get you out of the way. I don't think God has changed in the way He works. I'm going to remove this evil man out of the way so that verse 24 can happen. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. This man is hindering the work of the church. And if he stays in where he is, he might do more harm than good. Therefore, I'm going to get him out of the way. God works the same way today. He hasn't changed since the beginning, if you will. I think a third spiritual lesson that we can take from this is that God's will set the time of His purpose. And sometimes that's hard to calculate, if not impossible to do. God will set the time of His purpose. It goes back to the James-Peter argument. James, brother of John, you know, on that same day he called Peter, he called James and John. Do you all remember that? When he's walking down the side of the Sea of Galilee and he calls the sons of Zebedee, he calls Peter and Andrew. Andrew's there. And then he calls James and John. And James and John drop their nets, leave their father. Do you remember that? They were called on the same day. And yet those men who were called on the same day, James did what he needed to do. God's purpose for him was fulfilled, and therefore it happened. But with Peter, it wasn't done. He had a lot more work for Peter to do, and therefore He sent an angel into him in order to bring him out of that prison. We don't know how God sets the time of His purpose, and we can't possibly understand it. We don't know why certain things happen and why they do not. We don't understand when, if you will, we see over here injustice over here, and we see justice over here, and we see with our human eyes that this needs to be done and that needs to be done, but we're not at 30,000 feet like God, seeing the big picture, understanding the nuances of the situation and what needs to be done for the eternal purposes of what He wants to bring about. And so we see it from our mortal eyes. And that's where faith comes in. Because if we have faith in the immortal God, the mortal eyes can see. And so you and I can see His purpose in the fact that He wants people to come to Him and He wants people to be saved. And whatever it takes to do that, God will do. And He'll work it out in a way that sometimes we don't understand. Sometimes we don't understand. You know, I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. Y'all have heard it, I'm going to tell you anyway. My father got cancer. Everybody knows that. And he wasn't a Christian. And when my father got cancer, I prayed that the Lord heal him of his cancer. Lord, will you heal him? I prayed, usually daily, if you will. Would you heal my father of his cancer? Well, lo and behold, a year and a half later, he died. And I was kind of put out with God, to be honest with you, because I had prayed to God to heal my father of cancer. And so about a month after my father died, I was talking to my mother, and I told Mom about it. I said, Mom, I prayed to God over and over and over to heal my father of that cancer, and he didn't do it. Well, Mama said, well, what I've been praying is that God would use something to bring him to Christ. And my father, remember, obeyed the gospel a year before he died of cancer. And I realized on that day that my prayers were being counterintuitive to my mother's. That I was praying for him to be healed, and my mama was praying for him to be saved. And God used that cancer, I'm convinced, to bring my father to Christ. And he died a Christian. And when the day he died, he was much better off than the day before. God works things out strangely, doesn't he, in a way that we don't understand. We don't understand. I didn't understand why God wasn't answering my prayer until my mom told me that's the reason. It dawned on me. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so it's faith, brethren. It's faith in God. God will set the time of his purpose in the way that he wants to, in the right time, and in the way it works out the best. And that's why we have to have faith in God, that he will do those things in our lives. So with these thoughts in mind, if there's anyone here tonight who needs to ask for prayers or whatever it may be in your life as a Christian, we're here, we're gathered. We know the invitation or whatever a need is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we're here and we're gathered tonight. God can work things out, miracles in our lives if he wills. We just have to have faith. If you need anything at all, please come. We stand and sing this song. Unprepared.